Hello, good evening, Kyiv. It's nice to see that there are still so many people awake and willing to attend another talk. Just to warn you, this talk is not with slides. We have 2 slides, and after that we will switch immediately into live coding, which will fill the rest of this talk. So you have been warned. My name is Yann Cébron. I'm with the IntelliJ idea team at JetBrains, mostly working on the Spring support. And I'm happy to have Stéphane with me. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Stéphane. I'm working at Pivotal on Spring Boot and Spring Framework. And also I'm working with Yann. So I'm basically the proxy in the Spring team for everything related to tooling, especially with the JetBrains guys. So we're working together on making sure the Spring support in IntelliJ IDE is excellent.
Right. So today we have prepared a very simple and completely useless sample project. You can find that on GitHub. I'm going to post that on Twitter later if you want to find it. And yeah, let's jump into the IDE. So hands up who's using IntelliJ IDEA.
Okay. Eclipse? STS, Eclipse. One proud guy there. You're proud, I can see that. NetBeans?
Okay. So take a photo now.
NetBeans? No one NetBeans? There must be one guy.
Yeah.
There's always one guy using NetBeans. No, he's isn't here apparently.
Yeah, usually follows us, but okay, didn't make it to Kyiv. So, yeah, let's jump in. I'm just opening the project we prepared. You will also find the script on GitHub. So if you want to follow the steps we do here today, you can actually read what we prepared for demonstration things. So the first thing we notice is when I open this project, we get this notification here in the lower right corner, which tells us something about Spring configuration check. And what it basically tells us that we have some Spring configuration files in this project, which is not a surprise, and we need to do something about it. We need to set up and configure a Spring facet. So a quick recap, facet is basically a way of telling IntelliJ IDEA that there is some technology or some language or whatever which needs some additional configuration. And yeah, we need to configure a file set. What is a file set?
Yeah, so first of all, don't ignore that one.
Yeah.
That's probably the only, if there is one thing you can get from this talk is don't ignore that one, because this is basically the entry point to get Spring support. So if you're using Spring, you open a Spring-based project, regardless of the Spring features that you are using, until you configure the facet, most of the Spring features in IntelliJ IDE won't work properly. So you know that if you start a Spring-based application, you need to provide a set of configuration files. So basically your bin definitions on the configuration of your infrastructure. It could be XML config, it could be Java config. You could have simply a Spring Boot application entry point with component scanning. So there's plenty of ways you can build an app. And you simply need to tell IntelliJ IDE what is your current configuration. And most of the time, this is basically take the configuration of my project. You'll see that there is actually a shortcut. So please make sure to do that. If you're not sure, we will show you how you can access to that menu entry and make sure that the Spring facet is configured.
Right, so we can inspect the list of configuration files that IntelliJ has already found. We can also jump directly into the module to set up the facet. We are choosing a different step because you get a similar warning when you actually open the configuration files. So for now, I'm switching into the presentation mode so you can see better the code I'm doing. This is not accepted.
Snapshot build.
Yeah. So, by the way, the IDE version was compiled like 2 hours ago, so if something breaks, it's not my fault.
You didn't tell me that.
Yeah, so let's open the first configuration, this one here, and I forgot to prepare this, I'm sorry. So now we have this main configuration class here, and when I hover over this, I get the warning from IntelliJ IDEA that the configuration is not set up. So we have the configuration, add configuration here on the main configuration class, and IntelliJ warns us that nothing will work actually. And
There's an extra in, by the way, is you don't have any gutter icon on the left. So if you don't see any green leaves on the left, it's probably something is wrong. Because there's plenty of things that IntelliJ IDE is supposed to know, and it doesn't tell you anything about it, so it's probably because it doesn't know about the file. So this is what we were talking about, creating a file set, making sure that your configuration are included into that file set so that IntelliJ IDE knows about it.
Yeah, right. And I could just use one of my favorite shortcuts, which is Alt-Enter to bring up the quick fix menu. And one of the quick fix, or the first one, is actually to create a Spring facet. So I'm going to do this. We ignore what we see here, that's coming later. And now we get some support here. But it's still yellow. And the thing is that we have a Spring facet, but we didn't configure one of the Spring file sets. So that's the second step we have to take. Again, Alt-Enter, configure application context. We have to create a new one. And it's already pre-selected here. So I'm just okaying this. And as you can see, we have now all sorts of icons here on the editor gutter. And those indicate basically that the Spring support is now fully working and the IDE can now start resolving things and helping us with completion and stuff like that.
So a bit more about that is you may wonder what you have to do if you have a Spring Boot application, for instance. And as you will see later, the answer is nothing. So because Spring Boot comes with certain conventions, basically IntelliJ IDE will take those conventions and will auto-configure the facet for you. If you have a regular Spring MVC app, you'll see also that IntelliJ IDE will auto-configure a bunch of things for you. So we are back to the basics and really back to a simple Spring app with no support at all, just to show you how it works. But in practice, you'll probably create a facet and just create a file set into it with all your configuration files. If you have, for instance, more than one application within the same project, because you're working on different projects and you want to make sure that the application contexts are separate, then you'll have one file set per app, basically.
Right. So now we're going to take a look at all those nice icons we can find here on the left. And the first one I want to show is this one here. And it tells me something about Spring model dependencies. So what is that? We have a plain add configuration class here, but it also has some component scan. It has some imports for other configuration classes, and it even imports some XML configurations just for the guys who still love the 90s. So the problem you have usually in the IDE does not show you what will be there at runtime, right? I have this configuration class here, but it uses a lot of other things which are somehow connected, and getting the overview of this is very hard. But you can use this function here to actually visualize all those configuration files. Okay, so this is what IntelliJ really understands of all the things we configured here in the main configuration class. You can see all those arrows pointing to the imports or to the other resources we use. Import resource additionally imports another XML file, and this one even has another component scan. So you can see the whole graph of configuration files in your project, which is very, very nice when you join a new project and you have no clue on how the setup is actually working. So we can actually do another thing here in this diagram. I'm just jumping into this XML file here.
And you're going to make a mistake, right?
I'm going to do a stupid mistake just for demonstration purposes. So I'm actually duplicating the component scan definition we have here. And when I go back and re-invoke the diagram, oops.
The other diagram.
Yeah, that's
so
the
it's
other
a
variant.
It's a mistake we all made probably at some point, is especially if you use component scan for the first time, is to have that declaration several times and the same package being scanned twice. Or if you use Java config or even XML config, if you import the same class twice, which will in turn enable component scan again. This is probably going to run just fine because Spring Framework, the application context, will resolve that conflict for you. But it has a penalty impact on startup time of trying to create the same bean over and over again, and worse, if you don't have any ID on those beans, the context will allocate a default ID that's unique. So if you process it 2 times, you'll get those beans declared twice, and you didn't really expect that. So this is a configuration issue, and the editor is actually giving you good hints about what's going on.
Right, and those are the red errors we see here. They indicate that something is wrong with this dependency, and you can fix it right in your IDE without starting or deploying the application, which is a huge time saver, right? So when I put this off again, I go back, and the red error is gone. Everything is good again. So going back to our main configuration, let's just take a quick look at the editor support for all those Spring annotations. Of course, we have autocompletion here at various points. We can control-click anywhere. The same works here for this import resource annotations. So IntelliJ really understands what those annotations are about and helps you with autocompletion and even validation. So if I put some error here, it doesn't work, but it does
Snapshot
work here. So it gets immediately read, and you can fix any kind of setup errors immediately.
But one of my favorite new feature is the gutter icon on component scan. If you're not on the latest release, you may not aware of that one. If you click on that, you actually get the list of things that have been scanned by that particular directive. So it's very, very easy to know the impact of enabling component scan at a certain point.
Right, and a thing you should try out anytime you see some kind of list in IntelliJ is actually you can invoke actions on the currently selected element. So I can view the definition of this bean right from the list. I don't have to control click or go there, and to see the definition, I don't have to leave my current context. I just press the shortcut for view quick definition, and then I know, yeah, that's the right one I want to pick. Same stuff in completion list or any kind of other pop-up. So yeah, we can see all those beans now, and you can see another component scanner variant down here. And if we go there very quickly, this looks like a funny annotation. What is this about? So
this is for demonstration purpose, of course, just to show you that IntelliJ understands the concept of meta annotation. So in 4.3, it's something that we've been working on quite a lot, just to finalize the meta annotation story, helping you to craft dedicated annotation if that's what you want to do, and also provide dedicated annotation in the framework itself. So if you've probably used Spring MVC, you know the request mapping annotation, which is a general annotation to map a URI to a certain method. And you know that if you want to only intercept certain HTTP method types, you'll have to provide that as part of the annotation. And the feedback that we got was, can you get dedicated method that only intercept post or get or put? Since in a REST controller type, this is this is something that you do very often. So in 4.3, you'll see that there are new annotations. There is, for instance, a get mapping annotation, which is meta annotated with request mapping and method get. Same thing for post mapping, put mapping, etc. What's nice about this meta annotation story is that you can, it's not because you're crafting a dedicated annotation that you can't customize it anymore. So you can expose certain properties that basically map to the one that you are meta annotating from. So in this case, component scan has a base package, I think. Yes, base packages attribute where you can specify the list of packages to look for. And this demo annotation is basically exposing the same feature with a different name. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that you'll see more use of meta annotation within the framework, something you can also use in your own application, and you'll get support from the IDE for that.
Right.
Sorry?
Ah, okay, yeah, I can unfold the imports.
Okay.
So that's the full code. So in line 14, we can see this alias4 annotation, which actually helps us redefine or remap existing attributes from the inheriting or parent annotations. And IntelliJ really understands this. So I get autocompletion here. I can navigate to the original attribute if I really want and look up the documentation for that. And when we go back here, you can see that the gutter icon we had for the original component scan reappears as well for the meta annotation. So the IDE understands the relationship here. It sees that this custom annotation is a meta annotation of component scans, so we can provide the same features for those attributes where we already have some support, because it's just a name remapping in this case. And we have the pop-up here as well. So that works just as you would expect from the original annotation. And this is something that works basically for all annotations where we have some kind of support. If you use meta annotations, the ones built into Spring MVC, for example, or custom ones you define in your project, they will all work in the same way. So this is fully supported. Right, so much about this class. And the next thing we want to see is actually the Spring tool window. Who has ever used the Spring tool window in IDE? Nobody, nearly nobody, okay. So what is this about? It's basically a high-level overview of the Spring application. We can see the modules here, we can see the different contexts, we can see the configuration files, so that's exactly what we saw as well in the diagram here. And when I open one of the configuration files here, I can see the beans which are defined by this configuration. So we have a nice hierarchical view of your Spring application. You can even see the documentation of beans. So this is all nice, but what if I want to find a specific bean in this tool window? So one feature you can use for locating stuff in tool windows is the action select in, which is mapped to Alt F1 by default. And it brings up a pop-up menu with matching tool windows. So the IDE has knowledge about the current element we have and offers you the tool windows where you can actually open it. So when I choose Spring Beans, what it will actually do is to not work. I'm embarrassed.
Should I say it again? Build, snapshot build?
Yeah, sorry. It really works. Last time it did. So what it would do is actually to do this. Select the current path for you, and you can immediately locate the bean or the configuration class in this tool window. And the same works actually with Spring MVC. We are not going probably to see it because it's broken for some reason, but it does work.
Otherwise, you can see the recording on YouTube of a different session where it works.
Yeah. Okay.
But there is a problem in this file still. There is the an autowire thing in red. What's going on with that one? Yeah, so IntelliJ tells me we have some long field which we want to autowire, and apparently there are two beans here. And yeah, autowiring by type with two beans is not really something Spring can do for you, right? No, because there is two bean in the context. Bean of type long, again, it's a demo. You're not going to do that in practice, but whatever. There is two bean of that type. You ask to inject a bean of type long. There is two. We don't know which one you want to actually inject. So if you start this application, it will actually fail. And IntelliJ tells you right now it will fail, which is very interesting. Because when you're working with code or in a team and additional configuration is added by team members, some of your code may not work anymore, and you will only realize it by running the test or by restarting the application. And here you have an immediate feedback about that. So that's very nice. And again, if there is one shortcut that you need to remember from this session, so remember configure the facet, first super important trick. And the second super important trick is Alt-Enter. So whenever you have an error in IntelliJ, Alt-Enter is going to open you some suggestion about how the editor can help you to fix it.
Right, and in this case, I'm going to demonstrate the second one first. So we have two beans, so we have two candidates which might match, and maybe you are unsure what those beans really are. So you can just invoke this quick fix, and it will bring up all matching candidates here. And that's nice if you just want to take a quick look and make sure that it's actually what you think. But the other quick fix is here to add qualifiers. So when I do this, it will add qualifier annotations here and propose me the names of the beans so that Spring can actually choose the bean for us.
So qualifier is basically a hint for the container. You're basically telling, I know that those beans exist, but this is that one that I want. So you add additional metadata to the injection point, basically.
Right. So now we still have some yellow thing
IntelliJ
here on the
ID doesn't stop complaining
it's
as far as
still
I
not
can
happy
see.
about it, right? Yeah. So it tells me field injection is not recommended, and when I expand this, I actually get a bit more explanation, and it tells me I should use constructor injection. So what is this about?
I can appreciate the Spring recommends, so that it's on us and not on you. That's fine. But we do. We've been advocating that for quite a while. Field injection is something that you can do in Springland since the very beginning, and you can still do so if you want. And actually, in test, it's pretty effective to do that. So you won't get that warning in test, by the way, if you're wondering. But there are several problems while using field injection. One is that you're not able to easily test your component without Spring. And whenever you can do that, we encourage you to be able to do so. So if you use constructor injection, for instance, you can instantiate your object without Spring, which is a good thing for testing. And second thing, there is a lifecycle issue. If you use field injection, you might expect that the field will be initialized while if you have a custom code in the constructor. But actually it won't, because we need to create the instance first and then reflectively set the field once we have the instance, which means the constructor will have been called. So if you try, for instance, to access auto-wired long bean in the constructor, you'll get a null pointer exception, and that's really not intuitive at all. So the message is don't use it. If you disagree, there is a way to disable the inspection. We've been asked that quite often. So again, your friend alt-enter.
Right. So if I don't like this way, I should disable the inspection here or suppress it in specific cases using the intention menu here. But of course, we are going to follow the recommended way. And the IDE supports creating the constructor for us. So I'm just doing this, and the warning is gone. The constructor is created, auto-wired is added automatically to the constructor, and the IDE is happy again, and Spring will be too.
And by the way, something I forgot to say, which is I'm being reminded by the IDE here, your field becomes final, which is also a good thing. Because if you have dependencies, you do not expect to change those dependencies once the object has been built, right? It's something that the container provides to you. So it shouldn't change. And this is also an advantage of using constructor injection in this case.
All right, so much about auto-wiring for now. We have this funny looking green bar here over here. It says something about change profiles. So what is a profile in Spring?
So profile in Springland is a way to alter the configuration about regarding a certain environment, what the environment might be. You can think of it as production, QA, testing, whatever, profile. And one thing you could do in a Spring application, for instance, would be to change the database according to the environment. So you may want to start your app with an in-memory database in development. And of course, you want in production to use the real database. So one way to do that is to have a separate set of bean definitions in profile, in different configuration file tagged with a profile, and start the application by enabling a profile. What's important now is your configuration is not unique anymore. Remember, I told you about you have an app, you just put all the configuration files in that file set and you'll be done. That's still valid. But if you use profile, you may have different different path for the whole application context. So you need to tell IntelliJ about it. You need to tell it in which profile you are currently working on, and it will auto-adapt to the list of beans that are available, and it will also link to the right bean.
Right. So as Stéphane just said, we have to tell IntelliJ now what profile we want to see in the IDE. So I can just use this link up here, and it will give me a list of all the defined profiles in my project. So for now, I'm choosing the main profile, and it's also written up here. So you always see what profile is activated in your IDE. But what happens now when I change to the custom profile? So what is happening here now is that the long bean 1 is not available anymore, because that bean is actually only available in the main profile, not in the custom profile. And since we just activated only the custom profile, the bean is not longer visible. And the IDE respects that choice, and all the highlighting, auto-wiring, resolving and stuff is always matched against the profiles you just chose, right? So if I use auto-completion here, I actually see only the bean which is defined in the custom profile. And actually, since it's only one, I can remove the qualifier and everything will be good. The auto-wiring is working. I can click here. I can go to the actual injected bean, which is also very nice. So you see actually the link.
And you can see the profile definition in the configuration right there.
Yeah, it's up here. So
the add profile is what it basically telling that configuration file should only be enabled if that profile is enabled, basically.
Right. So that's about it, about profiles. Just remember to set the active profile or active profiles you want to work against in the IDE, so that you actually see the same thing as would be active on your production test or whatever environment you have. So the next topic is about Spring caching. What is Spring caching about, Stéphane?
Before I explain that, maybe a quick show of hands. Who does know about the cache abstraction in Spring? So cacheable and friend. Wow, 20%? Or you're all asleep already, but maybe? So cache abstraction is really a very simple use case. You have a method. That method has a set of parameters. It computes something or it fetches something from a remote service or whatever. And when you invoke that method, you want to avoid invoking it again if the value, the result of the method invocation has been invoked recently. So one thing you could do is basically in the body of that method interact with a cache, check first if there is an entry for a given key. If there isn't, just invoke your business logic and then put the value in the cache. And if there is a value in the cache, just take it from the cache and return it immediately. That's a lot of boilerplate code, and we don't want you to do that. And so what the cache abstraction does is there is really two things. There is an abstraction on top of caching libraries, so EHCache, Hazelcast, Infinispan, Ignite, Guava, Caffeine, well, all the caching libraries you may think of, there is probably an integration for that. So that's the first thing. So you don't tie yourself to a specific cache library. And then you basically annotate your bean methods with the cache aspect. We'll see that in a minute. So in this case, you have a very basic cache config here. The enable caching annotation is basically telling the context to enable that aspect. So look for methods that have the cacheable annotation, as we will see, and add a proxy around it to work with the cache. And I need a cache manager, and I'm just using a simple one for now. We'll see that later.
Right. So the first thing that strikes us again is, of course, that we didn't configure this caching config. So we are good citizens. We want things to work. Again, I'm using Alt-Enter to bring up the context switches. And now I can actually choose to add this configuration to the already existing file set. But I'm not going to do this because we want to split everything we do here semantically. So I'm creating another new application context here. I can actually also give it a name to distinguish it from my other stuff. And all the gutter icons are back to work. So yeah, let's go into the caching service we prepared, which is really very, very smart. It can build an integer list giving a start and end point.
I like that example, yeah,
And
really smart.
I can cache that integer list, which is a great feature, I think. But the thing is that IntelliJ is, again, not happy with my invention, and it tells me to not use the cacheable annotation in this case.
Does the description says again that Spring recommends? I never saw that.
Spring doesn't recommend in this case, so yeah. We need to align the texting, but yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay.
So why is that?
So if you make that kind of decision to use caching, it's probably an implementation detail. Again, you may disagree with that. We have users who disagree with that, and that's fine. But we think that such aspect is an implementation detail, so don't put that on the interface. Because if you want to implement that service and not use caching, if caching is enabled, then you won't have any choice. It will be enabled. So rather than doing that, let's maybe remove that line and look at the implementation instead.
Right.
And there is this cacheable annotation now, which is very complete, by the way. Most of the time, the only thing you'll get is the name of the cache. And as you can see here, actually, we get a warning again.
Yes, IntelliJ is full of warnings, and this one is about cache name. So what's a cache name that is missing?
Yeah. So no Spring recommends this time. That's nice. That's exactly what I want. This is an interesting story. So this is also why we are having this talk together, is to tell you a bit about the backstory and how we reached that point. Initially, the cache abstraction has been introduced in Spring 3.2. And it was a very, very nice abstraction with plenty of options. And one of the feature of at that time was the cache name was mandatory. So basically, there is a link between a name and a cache, and you provide a name. So for instance, I don't know, integers, which probably cache books and stores and customers and whatnot. And then in your cache library, so for instance, in your ehcache configuration file, you would create a region with that name. And we will make that link, okay? That name was mandatory. So if you look at the cacheable annotation, there is a cache name attribute, and it used to be mandatory. And it's not anymore. And it's not anymore because in recent releases, so in 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, the community asked us to improve that infrastructure, and namely to let you not specify that hardening in the annotation itself. So for instance, you could specify the cache name at class level. We have an example here, and Yann is going to uncomment that for me. And you'll see that if I do that, the error goes away. So the backstory is it used to be mandatory. It's not anymore, because you can specify that at class level. You can also implement a class named cache resolver, where you can programmatically decide what the actual cache will be, based on some programmatic decision of yours. But because it's not mandatory anymore, you don't have any compilation issue if you forget to put the name of the cache. So if you're a newcomer, you want to use that cache abstraction thing, you never used it before. So you start using the cacheable annotation, like, I mean, you're trying to see if that works. You get no warning, no compilation issue. You try to run your app, and then Spring Framework will complain that it can't find the name of the cache to use. So you can't be aware of that history. And what's really nice is that the IDE will actually guide you to know about that stuff right from the IDE, which I think is the most important part.
Right, and as you would expect, all the attributes in all the various caching annotations, of course, have code inside. So we already know what kind of bean is expected here. Again, we can invoke quick definition to see the bean definition. And we have something special here, the condition attribute. And this looks like an expression, and it actually is an expression, a spell expression. So what we can do here is actually to define a condition which is runtime dependent. So I can refer to the parameters, for example, in this case, to define the caching condition. And the nice thing is that the spell support really is context dependent. So in this case, the caching framework offers us a huge list of predefined stuff we can refer to. For example, we have all these things here like beans and stuff. For example, the custom cache manager we can refer to and stuff like that. So yeah, the IDE really understands that we are now in the caching context and that various stuff is available in this annotation because it will be available at runtime. And I can even use refactoring here and rename stuff and it will align everything, right?
So that's very, very, very interesting. So if you want to script a condition, you'll see that you can use that in many places in the framework. Mm-hmm. You'll get also assistance about what you can use. If we look at the Java doc of the condition attribute, for instance, if you can go back quickly. Yeah, I'm sorry, I know. Oh,
sorry.
Crap. You mean you didn't know the...
It works.
Finally. Okay, so if you look at the condition, yep. So if you look at the condition, the Java doc of condition, you'll see that there's a bunch of things. Oh, you can do this, you can do that, you have access to this, you have access to that. If you want to access to the arguments, this is how you can do it. Rather than reading all that, which didn't used to be that complete, by the way, and people were complaining because they didn't know what they can do with that thing. Again, having the IDE guide you and showing you the kind of options you have is very, very effective. And each spell expression may have a different context. So in the case of caching, you may have access to the method, you may have access to the target, you may have access to the cache names that have been computed. In the case of security, for instance, you may have access to something which is completely different. And the IDE will adapt to that for you.
Right, so the sample here is Spring Security, pre-authorized annotation, and as you can see, you get the autocompletion for all the methods which are available here, and it will also know about the root object here and the properties we can get from it. And it doesn't end here, it actually knows that this is a security role. So much about spell. Let's make a huge jump into Spring MVC. I guess the majority here would raise their hand if they use Spring MVC. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Okay.
So Spring MVC is one of the two Spring kinds of application which you don't need and should not configure yourself in a Spring facet. And when we go to the Spring facet here, we already see two MVC contexts which are automatically created by IntelliJ. It follows the rules which are given in the Spring MVC world to find those Spring MVC configuration classes and set up everything for you. And you cannot actually manipulate that because it has to be automatic. So when we go to the Spring MVC configuration class here, we can see that we have some stuff set up here for resolving against JSP and also for free marker here. We have free marker configuration and so on, and all the gutter icons are already working because the setup was done automatically by IntelliJ. So when we actually open a controller, for example, you will notice that the request mappings here also have some gutter icons. And this is one of my favorite features actually in the Spring MVC support. So because IntelliJ understands all those beans and all those setup code you've wrote, it will actually resolve from the controller to the view. So if I click here, I will actually jump to the JSP page, which I'm forwarding to from the controller, right? I'm using my view here, and it resolves to a specific JSP page. And the same works, of course, for all the other view technologies. So free marker, velocity, time leaf, whatever, right? Tiles, Apache tiles, it works the same way. And it doesn't end here. We have a model and view here, and we put some objects here into the thing. One is called an attribute for JSP.
Old school, I must add.
Yeah, old school, of course. And I can actually control-click here and go back to the exact definition of that attribute, right? And the same thing, just for demonstration, works for free marker, of course. So that's very nice.
And you can even see the definition in the view itself, which is quite nice as well.
Yeah. So in the view, again, I can use quick definition, and I can see the exact line of code which is putting this model attribute into my view scope. So one thing which is also very nice, or something you need when you have a huge application, you have a lot of URIs in your application, and maybe they don't really have a pattern matching to the controller code. So
you're more looking at, you have a certain address and you would like to jump directly to the method that's responsible to handle that address.
So we have a bunch of request mappings here. I can use the Spring tool window here and switch to the MVC tab. And I can see my list of controllers. In this case, we only have one, but all the request mappings here. And we will even get some hints about path variables and other stuff defined at this request mapping. But if you don't want to search in this tool window here, you can actually use go to symbol, which is Command-Alt-Shift-N.
You can remap that.
And if you type a /, it will actually list all the request mappings in your application. So when I go here, I actually end up at this manual redirect URL definition, which is defined in my configuration. Or if I use one of the controller request mappings, I get immediately to the corresponding request mapping. So if some user complains about some URI not working and you only get the address, you can immediately use that information to find the matching controller in your code. It doesn't end here, of course. As you would expect, we have some further knowledge here. We have a path variable, for example, and IntelliJ resolves that path variable. I can use renaming as well here, and some other things are supported as well. So we cannot show all the details, just try it out for yourself and discover what is possible here. Because we have one topic which is very important to Stéphane, which is Spring Boot, which we still want to cover for a few minutes at least. So what is Spring Boot? Just in one sentence.
Who was at my talk yesterday morning? Okay, I have the room, fine. So Spring Boot allows you to build application more easily using the Spring portfolio. It will provide you some infrastructure. It will help you to configure your infrastructure. So there's plenty of things. So if you don't know about the project, you should try it out. And one way to try it out is to go to start.spring.io. If you go on that site, you can basically generate a project with certain dependencies. Download the zip with an empty project but ready to run. Open that in your favorite IDE. Maybe it's IntelliJ IDE, maybe it's not. And start coding away, right? But what we want to show you now is how you can do the exact same thing right from the IDE, so without leaving the IDE. So to do that, you invoke the create project action. There is a Spring Initializer option there. And then you can just start configuring your project from scratch, right?
So yeah, we can give some basic information here. And the interesting thing is, of course, choosing all these Spring Boot starters. So those are basically like predefined
set of dependencies. Spring Boot will detect they are present, and it will auto-configure them for you if you don't have any opinion. So for instance, if you add the web starter, it is going to give you what's needed to build a web application, and it will configure Spring MVC for you.
Right, so the list of starters is actually quite impressive already when we scroll through here, especially anything that starts with cloud. So if you want to find something very quickly, you can just use a quick search up here, and you get all the matching starters right in one list, and I can just select the web dependency. On the right, I will see all my selected dependencies, and I'll hit done and finish. So IntelliJ just downloaded the generated project for me and unzipped it, created a new project for me. And this is what the Spring Starter web service created
So
for us.
you get the gutter icons. There is nothing for you to do, and something we don't see because we're in presentation mode. But there is also a run configuration that's created for you.
Right.
So basically, everything you have to do is click run, and well, basically it won't do anything because it's empty. But then you can start coding your business logic, basically.
Yeah. And as I said before, Spring Boot is one of the auto-detected kinds of applications. Everything is set up here automatically. We have a run configuration. I can just hit Shift and F10. It will compile and start the Spring Boot application for me, so you're ready to go without touching anything in the IDE, just using this wizard here. We recognize some of the Spring gutter icons in the main application we have here. So when we go to the dependencies diagram again, we see this. This doesn't look too impressive, but when I switch on Show Library Nodes, quite few nodes are added here. So what is all those nodes about? They all end with auto configuration here?
Don't be afraid, by the way. It's not going to start up in your application, right? So these are the things that Spring Boot actually might start, depending on your class path, depending on your configuration, depending on the environment. And the auto configuration may provide some beans. So for instance, if you add a RabbitMQ, because you want to use MQP and you have an MQP broker running somewhere, it will give you an MQP template. So it will give you an MQP template. Same thing for JDBC, same thing for JMS, and plenty of others. But those beans that are auto-configured, you need to inject them in your own code and work with them. And what the JetBrains guys are doing for the moment is to improve the detection model to also figure out the beans that will be provided at runtime. So we've seen at the beginning of the presentation that if you have a file set with some configuration, you get the full list of beans. So these will always be loaded unless it's in a profile that's not active. In the case of Spring Boot has conditions, rich conditions, to figure out whether or not it has to create that bean for you. And what it does, well, it would be nice that you know about that and you can refer to it. So that's the next major theme for them. So you can see all the list. It doesn't mean that all those auto configurations are actually going to be applied in your project. 99% of them actually won't in this case, since there is only the web starter in it.
Right. So what happens when I'm not happy with my initial selection of starters? I can add some starters to the auto-generated Maven POM or Gradle. It also supports Gradle. But for some specific things, we also added smart detection support. So for example, when I add enable WebSocket up here, I can again use Alt-Enter. And IntelliJ knows about some specific annotations which are commonly used and suggests us to add the corresponding starter instead of adding some kind of generic Maven dependency coordinates. So when I hit this, it will actually download the corresponding or add the corresponding starter for me. And when we check the Maven POM, we can see that the WebSocket starter has been added for us, and we just had to press two keys, right? So that's very nice. So one thing you didn't tell us, if you are unhappy with the auto configuration, what are you going to do then as a user of Spring Boot?
You're going to either define a bean, or if you want the auto configuration to still apply, you're going to customize it using the configuration infrastructure. And this mostly happen with configuration keys. So each auto configuration exposes a set of keys you can use to customize how it works. So if you need to know those keys, what do? Well, you start on Google, Stack Overflow, documentation, etc. But we don't want you to do that. We want you to stay in the IDE. And we want you to be able to search for those keys and get information about it, get the default value, get the documentation, jump to the actual definition of the key so that you can better understand how it's being used. And what's really nice about all this is that you can add your own keys. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to show that.
No.
But keep in mind that if you have in your own application, you must have some configuration that you need to tune at runtime, whatever the reason are. And keep in mind that you can add your keys very easily in that list. But we don't have time to show that.
No, but I want to show one last thing, the last gutter icon we are going to cover today. By the way, if you don't like the gutter icons, you can customize them in the editor settings and switch them off specifically. And one thing that actually works is that the IDE understands all these configuration properties, override properties you can use, and I can actually jump to the usage in my configuration file. So you can immediately see what configuration properties are overwritten in your application properties, or YAML if you prefer YAML. And yeah, that's very nice to see how the setup works.
And the refactoring works as well. So if you have, again, if you're working on your own configuration and you change your code, the Java code of that property, it will be also updated in the configuration file for you.
Right. We are done with our talk. We are running out of time. We have so many more things to show you. If you like, we also have a huge part in our script about the Spring XML support. So there are more tricks hidden there, which we didn't show today. I hope, or we hope you enjoyed it. And please come to us and ask more questions if you want. I also have some key map shortcut references for the first 10 or 15 people who show up here. So thanks to everyone and enjoy the evening, the last slot, and thank you very much.
Thank you.